Academica Media. From Academica Media Studios in Miami, Florida, it's Big Ideas in Education, a weekly recap of inspiration and innovation in your schools.
Hello, education lovers. Welcome to this week's installment of Big Ideas in Education. I'm Ryan Kairalla, and really excited for our interview this week. Joining us on the program is renowned clinical psychologist and parenting educator, Robyn Koslowitz. Dr. Koslowitz is also the host of the Post-Traumatic Parenting Podcast, a program that helps parents navigate giving their children a healthy childhood in the face of traumatic events. Our guest specialization has become all the more important as families continue to confront the difficult realities presented by the COVID pandemic. You can find the Post-Traumatic Parenting Podcast on all major platforms. Dr. Koslowitz, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Oh, this is going to be an exciting interview and such an important topic. We actually launched Big Ideas in Education in the wake of the COVID pandemic. We started about 2019, 2020. And so a lot of our content became COVID focused. We became sort of a lifeline for educators to be able to talk to them through the medium of podcasting and live streaming. And so this topic is something that's really important to us. We're excited to talk to you. A theme that I've heard you bring up in the past is that at one time your podcast and your work had a more narrow target audience as you were delivering your message primarily to parents who had confronted trauma in their own lives and wanted to break the cycle. They didn't want their children to face similar trauma. But more recently, I've heard you say that your audience is expanding because we've all faced trauma. Trauma is not unique to a specific population anymore because we've all gone through this collective trauma that is the COVID pandemic. And so now your message is one that a wider audience needs to hear. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I feel like, post-traumatic parenting is all about how do I stop my damage from damaging my kids? Whether that's as parents, whether that's as educators, what impact does trauma have in the classroom? And what impact does trauma have in parenting? And initially, when I was explaining the book, like at conferences, I remember one particular literary agent saying to me, like, yeah, so like there's probably like 8 people in the world who have PTSD and are parenting, which I think she was very wrong about. I think a lot of us have had childhoods that maybe weren't traumatic, but that we don't want to replicate in our kids, or we want to do better. I think a lot of us want to break cycles. But since COVID, we are all post-traumatic parents because we have lived in unprecedented times. Like there is no template in recent memory of living through a pandemic like this, of all the, social change that's happened, of the way it's changed education and the world. So yeah, we're sadly all post-traumatic parents now.
It's interesting that you mentioned that literary agent told you that they essentially didn't think there was a big audience for this book because trauma is something that is so, is limited to such a small subset of the population, at least pre-COVID. But I'm glad you, had the expertise to acknowledge that it really isn't that small of a group. Perhaps people who've gone through trauma don't like to volunteer that information. And so,
Yep.
and they put on a brave face. But those people are out there. They represent a larger segment of the population than anyone feels comfortable admitting. And so they probably gravitate towards a show that's going to let them know that they're not alone and that, a lot of people are going through this trauma, even if they don't volunteer that information, and they want to make sure that their kids don't suffer through another generation of it.
Yeah, I like to simplify the definition of trauma a lot because people are always like, oh, well, what does it mean post-traumatic? To me, trauma is any experience that was too big for your brain to metabolize. That's all
Mm.
it means. So if you had something happen to you and you were like, oh my gosh, what just happened? What does that mean for me or for the world? Like, what does that mean about me? Then you officially experienced the trauma. So depending on who you are and what supports at home are, sometimes a childhood experience, like let's say bullying or social exclusion or food insecurity, things that don't rise to that level of that like ACES scale that people know about, the adverse childhood experiences scale, but were really difficult to handle, that's trauma. And if that casts its shadow on your life, like I had a post-traumatic parent who was really like anxious about her kids getting enough to eat or her kids' nutrition. And it came from her childhood of food insecurity. Like, her kids were fine, but there was so much anxiety around, like, what do I feed them? And are they getting the right nutrients? And, turning into all sorts of, like, kind of struggles between her and the kid about, like, are you eating enough beta carotene? And, all these kinds of things. But it really was her trauma of growing up in a home where she really didn't know if there would be dinner on the table. They weren't starving, but there wasn't enough food. Right. And that cast a shadow. What if you would ask her to say, I'm not traumatized, like I became resilient from the experience. Yes. And right. It's
Yeah.
yes, you handled that well, and you grew up to, like, really have a lovely family. And, she went to college, and she, really, really, like, did something amazing with her life. But at the same token, that experience is casting a shadow on her parenting in a way that isn't so great for her kids.
Well, that's an interesting thought there. How much of your work concerns, before you can even address helping parents not bring trauma onto their children and have it find a way into the child raising process, how much of your work is simply just getting your patients to acknowledge and admit in the first place that this trauma might be affecting their parenting and having impacts on them that they either don't acknowledge or just don't see?
Well, I do a lot of tell me why. Like, when a
Mm,
parent comes in, like, this mother came in saying, like, I can't get my kid to eat the healthy foods that I want her to eat. And tell me why. Why is it so important that she eat those foods? And tell me why, and tell me why, and tell me why, until we get somewhere. Because most 10-year-olds don't really care about the recommended daily allowance of beta carotene, or, if they ate the rainbow that day, or, if they're getting enough heart healthy fat. Like, 10-year-olds don't care about that. They just want to eat whatever their friends are eating or what they like. So why is it so important? And why is it so important to you? Because your kid isn't you, your kid has you. And it's very important to give parents that distinction, right? Because this is really about her own wounded inner child. And I see this with parents who want their kids to, do a lot of extracurriculars because they felt deprived when they couldn't. I see this with parents who, perhaps they were more shy and inhibited, and then they have a child who is also like that. And I've got to get them having more friends, but the kid's happy. The kid's fine. Like, the child is an introvert and is happy with a few friends, doesn't want to be the life of the party. And that's fine. That's how they were temperamentally programmed to be. Like, this is their personality. It's okay. But it's about the parent. So if it's not a problem, then it's not a problem, right? So it's our job to help the parent see what's you and what's your child, because in the end, we're the adults in the room.
yeah.
So we have to handle our stuff, so our stuff isn't parenting our kids.
Well, I'd like to return to a point that we were bringing up earlier that is still swirling in my head right now, which is the difficulty it can impose to just identify that somebody is going through trauma, because it's, again, not something that people volunteer, particularly students. And if it can be challenging even for an experienced professional to identify the signs of trauma, I think about how challenging it would be for non-professionals, particularly teachers and administrators in the school setting. And obviously, it's critical for those people to identify signs of trauma in students, because they're often the first identifiers of this and are in the best position to intervene and maybe bring those students to a professional to help them sort through that trauma. Can you give those people who are listening right now, the teachers and admins, any advice on how they can recognize signs of trauma in students?
So what I like to do is not so much recognize the signs of trauma, because that's a little tricky and that puts you in a diagnostic place, but more to make yourself available so that when a child does have something, they know that you're a safe person to come to. When you have a classroom where within the curriculum you're talking about emotions, you're talking about, I like to call it the science of you, right? You're talking about, you know, what do you do when you're really, really mad? What do you do when you're really, really frustrated? How do you handle it when, somebody laughs when you raise your hand and you made a mistake? And that's just sort of part of the conversation. Like, along with whatever you're teaching, you're weaving it into the curriculum, which is something I teach when I do a lot of teacher training. Um, And then you make yourself available for conversations with kids, whether you have a signal system in the classroom. Signal system that I like to use is I use like a 911, 811, 711 system, which is like 911, perhaps you're raising three fingers, which means like, I need to talk to your teacher immediately about something. 811 is I need to talk to you at some point during like the morning or during the day at some point. And 711 is there's something I'd really like to tell you, but it can wait.
Hmm.
The idea is because let's say you're teaching the cardiovascular system and someone's, grandpa just died of a heart attack and they're really feeling stressed out. If you have that 911 system and they raise three fingers and you come over and you check in, so you have a couple of minutes and then you check in, you're like, what's going on? The kid's like, my grandpa just died of a heart attack and it's making me really uncomfortable to learn about the cardiovascular system. And you have a mechanism for a calm down corner in the classroom, a place where do you need a moment? What do you need? That really builds fortitude in kids. Because then the kid, sometimes it's just, I just need you to acknowledge it. I just need you to know that I'm uncomfortable about this. Like if I stare out the window, I'm not spacing out. I am thinking of grandpa instead of the science lesson, right? So just that little moment of becoming available for the child, and it can be as simple as that, can already, because the thing about kids is they do want to talk and they do want connection, right? The other side of that is children often communicate with behavior. So if you look at every behavior as communication, as opposed to like, this kid is so disruptive, what is this kid trying to tell me with his disruption? And maybe what he's telling me is he doesn't have the skill to sit still. Maybe he's telling me that he needs some help with like neurodiversity, but maybe he's telling me something about how he's feeling about, an interaction that happened at lunchtime. And if I'm coming to it from that place of what do you need to communicate with me right now, disciplinary incidents go down, the kids feel heard, and it's just so simple because you just wove it into the curriculum. It's not like you're teaching it like daily and hitting them over the head with it. It's just sort of part of the structure of the classroom.
Well, that's always music to a teacher's ears, right? Because so many times when experts come in to help them with something, either in terms of curricular work or co-curricular, or helping teachers help students address psychological issues. So often we give teachers one more thing that they have to do, one more assignment, one more task, one more box to check. And so to the extent that we can help teachers intervene in a way that already fits seamlessly in what they're doing all of the time, that makes things so much easier. So, I mean, certainly what you're bringing up there is going to be pretty valuable and welcomed by teachers.
Yeah, I feel like I, recently was working with a school where the principal was very like back to basics, like reading, writing, arithmetic. That's what we teach, that kind of, school. And he gave me one fifth grade classroom to work with because the teacher was really pushing and some of the parents were really pushing for it. And the amount of conflict resolution those kids learned and the amount of engagement and disciplinary incidents that went down, he was sold. He was like, I want this in the whole school. Like, what did you do? And it was really as simple as giving the kids a mechanism for, all right, we had a conflict. How do we resolve conflicts? Let's remember, right? The problem is not you versus me. The problem is you and me versus the problem. One basketball court, two groups of kids who want to use it. How do we figure that out, right? Like, this is a problem. It's not that I'm so mad at you because you're such a big shot because you're taking over the court and you hog it all the time. That's not what the problem is here. Inadequate resources is a problem. How do we solve inadequate resources? And then that becomes a lesson in economics, right? That becomes like, it just interweaves into the curriculum in such a masterful way when you have a good teacher who can do that. And the kids feel heard. And what was turning into like days and days and days of everybody focus. Why do I see notes being passed? Why are you kids shooting daggers at each other instead of doing math? Became like, oh, we know how to resolve conflicts. We have a step-by-step solution. It's not like things became perfect, but the kids felt such ownership and such like competence. Like, oh, this is a skill I've learned. Like, I know how to multiply. I know how to solve conflicts.
Yeah, and that's, I think, something that I wish more, more folks like that reading, writing, and arithmetic principle would acknowledge. Is, there are some people who say, well, if we do too much of this kind of stuff in the classroom, we're drifting too far away from the academics. And I think people who adhere to that line of reasoning are forgetting two things. One, Maslow before Bloom, right? You need to be able to address these things before students can even be in a position to succeed in academic endeavors. And two, as you so aptly put it there in your last point, these kind of conflict resolution skills They are important things that schools should be teaching. They are just as valuable to your adult life as learning math and reading. And
Yeah.
so, it sounds like there's definitely a place in the classroom for this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, psychology is a science, right? Like I have a PhD. I always say, like, when we went to grad school, they didn't teach us flower arranging, right? Like we learned a science, which, it's a soft science. It's a science. There's a lot of statistics that comes into psychology, prediction, pattern analysis, right? That even really little kids can learn. And the thing is, this is the one skill where they come out of school feeling like, whoa, I know something. I had this with a mom who told me that we did this curriculum like in first through third grade in her kid's school. And at one point she was in Target and like her like littler kid, maybe her toddler, like her 4-year-old was having a meltdown. And the mom just was like in such desperation that she said, like, can you just control yourself? And the bigger kid who was like 7 was like, Mom, you say we need to self-regulate now. And then you look at him and you say, you're feeling angry. You really wanted the toy and mom's not getting it for you. Let's breathe. And it worked. Like the 4-year-old stopped his meltdown. And the mom was like, she's like, what, like what just happened? And the kid's like, yeah, we learned it in school. That's what you do when you have very big emotions. You name them and then you you name it, you claim it, you rate it to abate it, you appreciate it. Like she was just taking her through the steps and like you contain it by breathing. That's what you do. And then your big emotions go away and then you're smart again. And then you could think like it's not smart to scream and yell in Target because then mom's for sure not going to buy you the toy. So that doesn't make sense. And she's like explaining it to her mom and her mom's like, and I signed up for your parenting class immediately.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. And I have a 2-year-old toddler. I got to try some of that stuff on when I see them come home from daycare later today.
Yeah.
Really, really, really terrific insight there. Let me ask this now. When you do have a situation where a teacher does identify that a student is experienced or is going through a pretty significant trauma that is adversely impacting that student's ability to participate in the classroom effectively and stay on task and things like that, what are some next steps that teacher should take? Who should they be bringing into the process from there? How much is it in terms of reaching out to internal people in the school versus getting some external help from professionals?
So I like to use what I call a differ scale, which is, duration, intensive, frequency, and then we have how disruptive is it to family, education, and relationships, right? So if we're pretty high on that differ scale with everything, we say, okay, this kid is going through something. And at this point, we need outside help. Like we can't ask the teacher to be the psychologist. That's not fair. So at that point, it depends what the school has available. If there's school counseling, if there's an outside therapist that's going to work with the school. But the more you have a team, right, the more everybody's talking together and the more we're all on the same page, the more the parents know and the more the parents see that you're not coming from a place of blaming, right? Like, it seems like, Johnny's having a really hard time with the divorce. I'm not saying this what the mom might hear is you're a bad mom. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is Johnny's having a hard time with a life experience that a lot of kids go through. And we all want to help him. So let's have a communication circle and make sure that we're all on the same page and we're all on team helping Johnny. We're not on team punishing Johnny, getting mad at Johnny, even diagnosing Johnny. We're on the team of helping Johnny because that's the difference, right? Between resilience, between something happening to you and it breaking you and something helping you bounce back or bounce forward is that support. Like all the adults around you got you. This is really hard. We believe you. And we're all going to help you through it. So the more there's communication and the more the school really makes time for that communication. Like if the school says we value parent-teacher communication, but then they don't free up the teacher's time to ever talk to parents, then they don't, right? Where you put your money is where you put your values. So if you're like, we pay teachers to call parents, we have a free period for the teacher to go and call parents. And every so often, we have a logbook to see when the teachers are calling and what the content of the conversation was, then you really do value that. If there's a school counselor that can run point on that, if there's an outside therapist. But to me, once we're at the high end, if the differ scale is like 0 to 7, once we're at the high end, like once we're like at 7s in a lot of things, then we're saying, okay, then we need outside help. Like even school counseling is not going to be enough. We need a therapist. If we're lower on that scale, then we say perhaps school counseling is enough. If we're even lower, perhaps we can try some home teacher intervention together. It really depends just how disruptive is it.
And you certainly don't want to treat different cases. You don't want to treat cases differently. Or sorry, you do want to treat cases differently based on the
Yeah.
severity of the incident. You want to look at everything on a case by case basis. Dr. Koslowitz, I've heard reference to a term called a trauma informed classroom. And I made a little mental note that when I had the chance to talk with you, I would have you explain what that is to me. I would just imagine from just the context of the phrase that a lot of what you've brought up here in terms of creating an environment where students feel free to communicate trauma is part of the essence of what a trauma-informed classroom is. Can you tell us more about what that is and how these kind of classrooms can be created?
So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about trauma-informed classrooms because I think a lot of people think that we're raising a generation of snowflakes and we're not, we're not challenging kids enough. But when you think of trauma, trauma is toxic stress, and it's toxic stress that humans are meant to stress, right? We enjoy positive stress. Like it's fun to like finally master the tricky bars or to like run a race and like, come in third and you really ran your best race. Like we enjoy those experiences, right? This is fun. We like a roller coaster. So what we're looking for in a trauma-informed classroom is we're looking to keep the stress levels at that positive, expected, tolerable level of stress and not at that toxic stress where I'm frozen and I'm terrified and I'm upset. And sometimes it's as simple as what I said before. Like I can just tell my teacher that like this is bringing up memories of grandpa's heart attack and I'm good now. Now I went from toxic stress to normal stress and I'm fine. That toxic frozen stress, we don't want that. So if a child is coming into school and they're still really worried about like, oh no, today's payday, dad's going to come home drunk. How am I handling life? That's not positive stress, that's toxic stress, right? And we want to be able to have a way of keeping stress at that positive level because humans are anti-fragile, right? We benefit from mild levels of adversity, but we want to make sure that the adversity is indeed mild. It's one thing for a child to be in a spelling contest or, to take a challenging test and then feel like I did the best I could. Didn't get that straight A, but I did the best I could. I studied hard. I know a good 90% of this material. I'm proud of myself. That feels good. If a child comes into school and there's a pop quiz and the teacher's like, oh my gosh, you failed. I'm going to hang your F up for the world to see as they did in like the 50s and 60s. That is toxic stress. So we just want to understand stress and keep stress at the tolerable, manageable level because that's what we grow from, right? It's fabulous to like push yourself. I remember when I taught literature, like asking kids like, this is actually a bit above your level. This is complex. I'm going to ask you guys to read through the story and think hard, right? For like a moment,
Yeah.
let's think hard about what's going on in this story. I know it's a little above you and I know you can get it.
And so the essence of a trauma-informed classroom is creating an environment in which positive stress can thrive, but this kind of negative stress that just freezes you up and doesn't allow you to reach your full potential is eliminated.
Yeah, to give another example, I had a teacher that I was working with where her students just had tremendous test anxiety. Everything was like, so she would like walk into the room and the kids would be, and she would say, okay, in 2 weeks we're having like a math test. And the kids would like, she would see this frozen like, and she'd be like, oh my gosh, the anxiety monster has entered the classroom. Everybody, let's hear, what is the anxiety monster saying? And all the kids were like, what if I fail? What if I don't know it? Oh my gosh, this is awful. And then, prediction from 0 to 10, how bad is this test going to be? And then, they did some exercise, like, let's just do some jumping jacks, get all the anxiety out of us. We're still having the test, right? I think that's the key part. Because that's, if we weren't having the test, then you'd be right. We're making snowflakes, but we're still having the test and we're going to deal with like the adrenaline in our bodies. And then she had them do this very simple thing. They predicted how bad the test was going to be. And then after they took the test, they wrote how stressful it actually was. So anxiety was like, it's going to be on a scale of 1 to 10, it's going to be 4,000. And then it was a 4.
Yeah.
Like, oh, so what have we learned? We've learned that even when anxiety yells at us, he exaggerates. That's okay. It's scary and I can do it. That's a trauma-informed classroom.
Oh, I like that a lot. And, I teach college students, and I feel like even with that population, engaging in some of these exercises before I give them a quiz
Oh, yeah.
could have a lot of value. I have noticed like in the last, I've been teaching college students for over a decade now, and I feel like certainly, test anxiety has always been a thing, but I feel like in the last few years, and maybe this is a post-COVID thing, I don't know, but I feel like they tend to be more anxious about tests than they were, even a decade ago. I don't know if that's just like the small sample size of the class I teach, but maybe it's just the general state of the world. Like, even college kids are more anxious than they used to be.
Yeah, and all a test means is you didn't know the material as well as you thought you did. Here are the areas you have to study. Like I remember when I went for my boards and that's literally how I studied. Like I took a fake boards. It told me what I failed on and I was like, great. Okay, I know stats well. Don't need to study that. But organizational psychology, which I didn't do, I don't know that at all. I'm going to have to read up on that. Great. Like this is just data for me. And now I know what I don't know. That's all a test really is. It just tells you what you know and what you don't know. I think you're right that post-COVID kids are more anxious about tests. And sometimes that 1 second conversation of this is what a test is. This is all it is. This is all it means. And sometimes that kind of cluster grading of like, you knew the multiplication well, you were weaker at the division, right? You have your basic math number facts down cold is so helpful for kids because it's like, oh, so here's the thing you need to improve on, division. Got it. It's not like you got a 70. It's like you knew all the multiplication, you knew all the addition, division and subtraction was harder for you. I guess you like getting things, you don't like giving them away. Okay, great. Let's learn that. Fabulous. It's all it is.
Love it. I encourage our viewers and listeners to check out the post-traumatic parenting podcast. Boy, I do love alliteration. Post-traumatic parenting podcast. A lot of great insights. If you love what you're hearing here from our guest, Dr. Koslowitz, I'm sure you're going to hear more of that great stuff on that program. We got one more question for you before we let you go this week, and I'm particularly interested in hearing your answer to it. If with the snap of your fingers, you could make any change to the education system, what change would it be?
I think the biggest change I would make is really bringing the science of you into every single classroom. Getting kids to understand themselves, understand psychology, understand how humans operate in the world, whether by themselves or with each other, because then kids have a life skill that they can apply to every single context that they're ever going to be in. If they know conflict resolution, if they understand body language, if they understand themselves and their stress response, then you're really golden in the workforce, right? That's the emotional intelligence stuff that we actually need in life. Because let's face it, nowadays with like AI and with everything that we have at our fingertips, the actual skills of like, I still learn stats with like a slide rule, right? You don't need that anymore. It's a matter of operating computer programs now. But emotional intelligence is the one thing AI can't really do for us, right? So that's the piece that kids really need to learn.
Completely, wholeheartedly endorse. Thank you so much for your insights this week. You've given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Right back at you. And thanks to all of our viewers and listeners for checking out Big Ideas in Education.
The views expressed on the preceding program have been those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Academica, its clients, staff, affiliates, or advertisers.